So it's a really good opportunity to talk about what I think is a critically important issue, and an area where I think we still certainly don't do enough in terms of helping people with a mental illness. We know that mental illnesses, of course, are very common. They also are associated with low rates of employment and low rates of work inclusion. And the reasons for that include myriad issues, which I'll come to shortly. But just to emphasise before that, why is it important for people with a mental illness to be able to get into work? Well, many of these are generic issues which pertain for the general population, but in a way are doubly important for people with a mental illness because they often are excluded from other aspects of social integration. So if they can be employed and gainfully employed, that's often very good for their self-esteem, their sense of self-worth. It also can be very useful in terms of regulation of life, so getting up in the morning, having something to get up for, to get out of the house for, to be able to socialise, to be able to integrate with others, and also the broader community benefit of work colleagues being able to understand that people with mental illness are just people like everybody else, but happen to have some particular vulnerabilities in terms of their mental illness, also have particular strengths in terms of their individual strengths that they bring to the workplace, and that can be very helpful in breaking down stigma, which is still a pervasive and difficult barrier for people with mental illness. So why are people with mental illness less likely to be employed? A lot of it, I think, is a lack of knowledge or understanding on behalf of a number of different groups about the fact that, in fact, the majority of people with mental illness, in fact, can be gainfully employed. And I think some of the blame for that ignorance is the clinicians, like psychiatrists, for example, who will be reaching for the disability support pension pad quite quickly, rather than talking to the individual about work being a meaningful and realistic goal for them as an individual. So I think early on in the piece that clinicians involved with the care of people with mental illness should be sending a much more positive message. Of course, a realistic message that might not be an immediate return to work immediately after an episode of illness or a first onset of illness, but that certainly this should be part of the patient's and the clinician's expectation that they would be able to go back to at least some form of work. Often employers as well have ignorance about the fact that people with mental illness can be very effectively and gainfully employed. And unfortunately this leads many people with mental illness to feel very embarrassed about their mental illness, to not divulge, and if you don't, well, obviously it's people's right to divulge or not to divulge, but if you don't divulge or you don't feel safe about divulging, at least to some key individuals within your workplace, then it can be very difficult for the workplace to be able to adjust and accommodate what might need to be accommodated in terms of that particular individual. So it has to be a two-way communication issue. But the person with the mental illness needs to feel safe enough about that integrated process to be able to have the meaningful discussion.